Into the Abyss. Custer's final hour. A battle in the shadows, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, is steeped in myth and legend, but at its core lies a tragic series of decisions made in the final hour of George Armstrong Custer's life. This was no ordinary battle. It was a pivotal clash between the unyielding ambition of a man seeking glory and the full might of a people defending their way of life. Over the years, historians have painstakingly reconstructed the fragments of that fateful day. Yet Custer's last moments remain shrouded in uncertainty. What did he truly see? How did he react to the battlefield shifting beneath his feet? Most importantly, what choices sealed his fate and the fate of his men? This video delves into that final hour, not merely recounting the chronology, but uncovering the nuances, miscalculations, and overlooked complexities that determine the outcome of one of history's most studied military engagements. The calm before the stormy air was thick and oppressive, the weight of the summer heat pressing down on the arid plains. It was June 25, 1876, 1:05 p.m. As George Armstrong Custer surveyed the horizon, he stood at the precipice of a moment that would either cement his legacy as a brilliant tactician or unravel into catastrophe. The 7th Cavalry had crossed the divide between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers, each step carrying them deeper into an uncertain fate. The stakes could not have been higher. Custer's mission was to subdue a vast coalition of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who had gathered in open defiance of U.S. government mandates. Yet, unknown to him, the decisions he was about to make would send him into the tunnel of history, where speculation and conflicting testimony would forever cloud the true nature of his last stand. As Custer gazed over the rugged terrain, he made the bold choice that would define his final hour. A fateful division, Custer decided to divide his regiment into 4 separate battalions, a decision that has fueled historical debate for nearly 150 years. Many argue that it was a grave miscalculation, fracturing his forces at a moment when unity was crucial. Yet Custer had reason to believe otherwise. His scouts had reported signs of a massive encampment ahead, stretching along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. It was a village far larger than he had anticipated, and he knew that. Surprise was slipping from his grasp. Faced with overwhelming numbers, Custer placed his faith in speed and audacity. His strategy was daring but deceptively simple. Major Marcus Reno would lead 3 companies in a frontal assault from the south, drawing the warriors' attention. Meanwhile, Captain Frederick Benteen would take another battalion to scout the ridges on the left flank, preventing any escape westward. Custer, ever the frontline commander, would lead 5 companies along the high ground to the right, attempting to flank the village and block any retreat to the north. The final battalion, under Captain Thomas McDougall, was assigned to guard the pack train and serve as a reserve force. This division of forces was not just a tactical maneuver, it was psychological. Custer had built his career on bold, unconventional moves, often outmaneuvering and outthinking his adversaries. Against Native American forces in prior engagements, his aggressive tactics had brought him victory. But this time, the battle would be unlike any he had faced before. The village ahead was a sprawling sea of teepees, sheltering thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, more than Custer had ever encountered in a single engagement. Yet he remained convinced that a swift, coordinated assault would send the camp into disarray. The beginning of the end, as the orders were issued, the regiment moved swiftly. Reno's battalion advanced down the valley on the left, while Custer's force paralleled them on the right. But the terrain quickly conspired against them, forcing their paths to diverge. What had begun as a coordinated plan now became a disjointed effort, with each battalion isolated by geography. This moment of separation, though physically brief, marked the beginning of the unraveling. From this point forward, each commander would be left to fight their own battle, reacting to an escalating chaos they could no longer control. Unaware of the sheer numbers awaiting him, Reno charged forward, his men soon facing a relentless counterattack. Meanwhile, Custer pressed northward, intent on cutting off any possible escape. His mind remained fixed on his strategy, Yet the records often overlook a critical reality. Custer was not merely gambling with the lives of his men. He was calculating, in real time, the balance of risk and reward in confronting an enemy whose full strength remained uncertain. With each passing moment, however, the complexity of his position became increasingly evident. Reno's assault, Custer's flanking maneuver, and Benteen's reconnaissance were all pieces of a larger plan, one that relied on timing, speed, and surprise. But coordinating these movements across miles of rugged terrain proved nearly impossible. And yet, Custer believed the risk was worth it. He had split his forces before and emerged victorious. But this time, the outcome would be tragically different. By 1:26 p.m., Custer and his men had committed to the high ground. As they ascended the bluffs overlooking the little Bighorn Valley, the scale of the village below came into full view. It stretched farther than anyone had imagined. In that instant, the gravity of what he was up against became undeniable. The trap closes still, Custer's resolve did not waver. He remained convinced that attacking from the rear, while Reno engaged the front, would secure victory. What he did not realize was that his enemy was not retreating, but rallying. His trusted interpreter, Mitch Boyer, and Scout Fred Gerard were the first to spot it. From their vantage point, they saw warriors driving ponies downstream, an apparent sign of flight. "There go your Indians, running like devils," Gerard shouted, but his instincts told him otherwise. This was not the desperate flight of a village caught off guard. It was the calculated movement of warriors preparing for battle. Gerard's urgent warning should have set off alarm bells. Yet Custer saw it as confirmation that his flanking maneuver was working. The warriors appeared to be focusing on Reno's assault, leaving their rear exposed. But Custer had misread the battlefield. The terrain itself now became his greatest enemy. The steep bluffs and rocky ridges slowed his column's progress, forcing the men into a stretched-out formation. Horses struggled for footing. Communication between the vanguard and rear became increasingly difficult. Below, Reno's forces were not pressing forward. They were in full retreat. His battalion, overwhelmed by the sheer number of warriors, had been driven into a desperate withdrawal across the river. The coordination on which Custer's entire plan depended was crumbling, yet neither he nor Reno understood the peril the other was facing. As Custer's men continued northward, they unknowingly marched straight into a trap. Warriors led by Crazy Horse, Gall, and other Lakota and Cheyenne leaders were not scattering, but converging. The landscape's natural ravines funneled Custer's men into a bottleneck, leaving them exposed. At 1:42 p.m., Custer reached a vantage point overlooking the battlefield. The sight before him was foreboding. Smoke rose from the village. Reno's forces moved erratically, and ranks of warriors were forming in the distance. Yet, despite these ominous signs, Custer remained committed to his plan. He trusted in his ability to outmaneuver his enemy, as he had done so many times before. But this time, he had underestimated the force he was facing. This was not merely a battle. It was the final stand of a commander who believed he was shaping history, only to become a legend swallowed by it. Custer's fatal miscalculation, Custer's misreading of the battlefield, compounded by the physical separation between his column and Reno's, would prove disastrous. Among those who later recounted Custer's final moments was Curley, one of his Crow scouts. From his vantage point, Curley observed what Custer could not: the column stretching dangerously thin as it advanced into the coulees, the rough terrain dictating its increasingly fragmented formation. More ominously, Curley saw movement on the ridges above, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors already maneuvering to cut off their path. The warriors, led by Gall and Crazy Horse, had anticipated Custer's flanking maneuver and were now positioning themselves to counter it. As the battalion pressed into Medicine Tail Coulee, the last narrow ravine before the village, Custer's fate was sealed. Scouts had reported spotting small war parties in the distance, but by the time the full scale of the trap became apparent, escape was no longer an option. His force, now strung out and isolated, was in no condition to mount a defense. The counterattack begins. The full force of the Indian counterattack was about to descend upon them. Among the many overlooked figures in traditional accounts of the battle is Iron Cedar, a Hunkpapa warrior whose actions proved pivotal in shaping Custer's final stand. Upon spotting Custer's movements from the ridgeline, Iron Cedar rode hard to the village, sounding the alarm. Within moments, the entire encampment knew of Custer's approach. Warriors moved with precision, surging toward the ridges and the river crossings to intercept the advancing soldiers. Gall, who had been focused on repelling Reno's initial assault, now turned his attention to Custer's flanking force. By 2:05 p.m., Custer's battalion had reached the bottom of Medicine Tail Coulee. Exhausted from the grueling march under the punishing summer sun, the men paused to regroup. But they had no time to prepare for what came next. Before they could form a defensive line, the first volleys of gunfire rang out, shattering the stillness of the ravine. The attack was swift and merciless. Unlike the disorganized retreat that Custer had expected from the village, the warriors struck with overwhelming force and coordination. A commander reacting, not charging blindly. Custer's final hours have often been mischaracterized as a reckless charge into the unknown, but the reality is far more complex. He was not blindly throwing his men into battle. He was making rapid adjustments based on the intelligence available to him. But the sheer scale of the native resistance, combined with the harsh terrain and the fragmentation of his forces, left him with few viable choices. By the time his battalion descended into Medicine Tail Coulee, the battle's outcome had already been decided. The land itself now worked against him as much as the warriors who surrounded his men. The terrain turns against Custer what had initially seemed like a tactical advantage, using the coulees for concealment, now became a deadly trap. The deep ravines and twisting pathways funneled his men into narrow corridors, limiting their mobility and disrupting any coherent formation. As the sun beat down, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, the once disciplined march of the 7th Cavalry unraveled into a desperate struggle against both the terrain and their growing fatigue. But for Custer, the descent into Medicine Tail Coulee was not a retreat. It was his final tactical maneuver, a last attempt to outflank the village and strike a decisive blow. At 2:05 p.m., Custer and his men reached the base of the coulee. From there, the Little Bighorn River shimmered in the midday light, the barrier they needed to cross in order to complete the encirclement of the village. His plan was bold yet straightforward: press through the coulee, ford the river, and strike the village from the rear, trapping the enemy between his battalion and Reno's forces. But Custer was operating under a fatal assumption. He still believed Reno was engaging the front of the village. In reality, Reno's attack had already collapsed. The collapse of Reno's assault, unbeknownst to Custer, Reno's forces had been driven into full retreat. At approximately 1:45 p.m., Reno, facing overwhelming resistance, had ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line. But the warriors, led by Crazy Horse and Gall, launched a devastating counterattack, swarming Reno's exposed position. Reno's men, outmaneuvered and outnumbered, had fled into the timber along the river in a desperate bid to hold their ground. From Custer's position high on the bluffs, this chaotic retreat was obscured by the rugged terrain. As a result, he pressed forward, still believing that Reno was successfully holding the enemy's attention, leaving the village vulnerable to a flanking assault. The trap closes. Eyewitness accounts from scouts like Curley and Mitch Boyer provide critical insight into this moment. Both observed Custer's column thinning as it descended into the coulee. The punishing heat and unforgiving landscape had taken their toll. Both men and horses were struggling to maintain pace. Boyer, in particular, sensed growing unease among the troops. They had expected to encounter panicked villagers fleeing in all directions, yet the signs pointed to something far more ominous: a disciplined and prepared defense. What Custer could not see, but the warriors could, was that his force was now fully exposed. Iron Cedar had already alerted Gall and Crazy Horse to the flanking battalion's movements. By the time Custer's forces reached the bottom of the coulee, the warriors had already taken strategic positions on the surrounding ridges, poised to strike. The noose tightens Custer's descent into Medicine Tail coolly represents a critical turning point in the battle, one often overlooked in mainstream narratives. Initially a route of concealment, the coulee now became a death trap. The narrowing corridors funneled Custer's men into confined spaces, while the warriors, positioned on higher ground, had the advantage of both elevation and surprise. Custer's plan to outflank the village was unraveling in real time. His assumption that the village was vulnerable had been catastrophically wrong. Instead of catching his enemy off guard, he had marched his battalion directly into an ambush. As the first shots rang out, the mood among his men shifted from focused determination to grim realization. The final "Stand the Hills," once silent, erupted with the shouts of warriors and the relentless crack of gunfire. The warriors, mounted and armed with rifles and bows, surged down from the ridges, encircling Custer's battalion from all sides. Custer, still committed to his plan, ordered his men to prepare for an assault. But by now, the truth was undeniable. They were trapped. Eyewitness accounts from both surviving scouts and native warriors described the ferocity of the battle that followed. Gall and Crazy Horse had executed a flawless ambush, using the terrain to maximum effect. From their elevated positions, warriors rained down gunfire with devastating accuracy. Every step Custer took deeper into Medicine Tail coolly only tightened the noose around his men. His soldiers, now fully aware of the overwhelming force against them, attempted to form defensive positions, but the landscape offered little shelter. Their tactical options were evaporating by the second. Retreat was impossible. The coulee's narrow passages, combined with the warriors massing on the ridges, made withdrawal suicidal. Advancing was equally perilous. The river crossing ahead was now guarded by an ever-growing force of warriors. Custer's audacious plan to encircle the village had collapsed into catastrophe. Instead of trapping the enemy, he had led his men into a fight from which there would be no escape. A brutal endgame. The intensity of the battle at Medicine Tail Coulee is often understated in traditional accounts, but significance cannot be ignored. The native warriors, emboldened by their superior numbers and mastery of the terrain, fought with relentless ferocity. Their unity and strategy stood in stark contrast to Custer's fragmented command. And so, in the ravines and ridges above the Little Bighorn, history was sealed. Custer's last stand was not a reckless charge, but a desperate fight for survival, one that would end in total annihilation. The encirclement tightens Gall, who had initially been focused on repelling Reno's assault, now turned his full attention to Custer's flanking force. From their elevated positions on the ridges, his warriors unleashed a relentless barrage of rifle fire and arrows into the exposed cavalry below. Meanwhile, Crazy Horse, known for his fearless and unconventional tactics, led a series of daring mounted charges, further throwing Custer's men into disarray. Despite the chaos engulfing him, Custer remained steadfast. He had faced long odds before, and his belief in his own tactical prowess was unwavering. He ordered his men to hold their ground, still anticipating that Benteen's battalion would arrive to reinforce them. But what Custer did not realize was that Benteen had been delayed. By 2:20 p.m., Benteen's forces were still miles away, slowed by rugged terrain and uncertainty over where exactly to rendezvous with Custer. The reinforcements Custer so desperately needed would never arrive in time. No, escape. The encirclement was now complete. Custer's men, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, were trapped in the bottom of the coulee with no path to retreat. The warriors on the ridges commanded the high ground, pouring deadly fire down upon the beleaguered cavalry. Many of Custer's soldiers, unfamiliar with fighting against such a formidable and determined enemy, now found themselves locked in a desperate struggle for survival. The air grew thick with dust and smoke, obscuring the battlefield as gunfire echoed through the valley. The once confident cavalrymen scrambled for cover, using their fallen horses and the shallow depressions in the ravine as meager shields against the withering onslaught. At this moment, the battle's outcome was no longer in question. The overwhelming number of warriors, coupled with the unforgiving terrain, had sealed Custer's fate. The question was no longer if his battalion would survive, but how long they could hold out before being completely overwhelmed. By 2:30 p.m., Custer's forces were in full retreat, though there was nowhere left to go. The coulee had become a killing field, and one by one, the soldiers fell under the unrelenting fire of their attackers. Recognizing the hopelessness of his situation, Custer gathered his remaining men and led them toward a small rise in the terrain, a last, desperate attempt to regroup and make a final stand. The Last Stand to Rise, later known as Last Stand Hill, would become the site of Custer's final moments. The legendary Last Stand has been immortalized in history, often romanticized as a heroic fight to the death. Yet, stripped of myth and embellishment, what occurred on that hill was not a noble stand, but a frantic and chaotic struggle for survival. By now, fewer than 50 men remained. Their ammunition was nearly depleted, and the horses they had used for cover lay dead or dying around them. The midday sun bore down mercilessly as the remaining soldiers fired their last desperate rounds into the mass of warriors closing in on all sides. Custer's leadership in these final moments remains a subject of debate. Some accounts portray him as a valiant figure, standing defiantly in the face of certain death. Others suggest that he was disoriented, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of the catastrophe unfolding around him. What is undisputed, however, is that Custer fought to the bitter end. According to native warrior accounts, he was among the last to fall, his body found near the top of the hill, surrounded by the men who had followed him to their deaths. The final blow, with Custer's position completely overrun, the warriors surged forward to finish off the last remnants of resistance. The battle, which had begun as a tactical engagement, now devolved into brutal and deeply personal combat. Many of the warriors had lost family members in previous conflicts with the U.S. Army, and their desire for retribution burned fiercely in those final moments. The soldiers, out of ammunition and with no refuge left, were swiftly overwhelmed. Some accounts describe desperate hand-to-hand combat as warriors, wielding war clubs and knives, closed in to dispatch the last survivors. By 2:45 p.m., the battle was over. Custer and his entire battalion had been annihilated, their bodies scattered across the hillside. The victorious warriors, having achieved a triumph unlike any before, began stripping the fallen soldiers of weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The aftermath, according to several Lakota and Cheyenne accounts, the body of Custer himself was left largely untouched, a mark of recognition that he was a significant figure in the battle. The exact reasons remain debated. Some say it was an act of respect, while others argue it was mere chance. The rest of his men were not so fortunate. Many soldiers' bodies were mutilated in acts of retribution, a grim testament to the bitter history of conflict between the Plains tribes and the U.S. Army. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, the victory was monumental, a defiant stand against American expansionism and a validation of their strength and unity. For the U.S. Army, it was a devastating and humiliating defeat, one that would ignite widespread outrage and an unrelenting campaign to crush Native resistance in the West. The final moments of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, as explored in this account, reveal a tale of tactical miscalculation, hubris, and the brutal realities of warfare. Custer, once hailed as an audacious and brilliant commander, had met his match, not only in the skill and resilience of the native warriors, but in the unforgiving landscape and the limits of his own leadership. The silence after battle by 3 p.m. on June 25, 1876, the sounds of battle had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness over the valley. The sun hung high in the sky, illuminating the now silent battlefield where, just hours earlier, one of the most decisive clashes between the U.S. Army and Native American warriors had unfolded. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors moved through the field of the fallen, tending to their wounded and mourning their dead. Among them, there was triumph, but also an unshakable solemnity. Victory had come at a cost. For the Plains tribes, this was a moment of profound significance. It proved that they could stand against the military might of the United States, that they could resist the ever-encroaching threat to their lands and way of life. But many warriors understood that this was not the end of their struggle. The U.S. government would not let such a defeat go unanswered. Leaders like Sitting Bull, Gall, and Crazy Horse recognized that while they had won the battle, the war was far from over. A turning point in history, the aftermath on the battlefield was grim. The bodies of Custer and his men lay exposed under the relentless summer sun. Days later, General Alfred Terry and his forces arrived to survey the devastation. What they found was a scene of total destruction, dead soldiers, scattered equipment, and the remnants of a shattered command. The sight of Custer's battalion, wiped out to the last man, sent shockwaves through the nation. In the weeks that followed, newspapers sensationalized the disaster, transforming Custer into both a tragic hero and a cautionary figure. Some hailed him as a fallen warrior, while others criticized his arrogance and strategic errors. The brutal reality of the battlefield became a rallying cry for the U.S. Army, which launched a relentless campaign against the Plains tribes in the aftermath of Little Bighorn. Within a year, the balance of power had shifted. The Great Sioux War continued, and the native forces that had secured such a dramatic victory would soon face an overwhelming and unforgiving military response. The Battle of the Little Bighorn remains one of the most legendary and controversial moments in American history, a story of ambition, defiance, and the tragic consequences of miscalculation. By the time the sun set over the valley that fateful evening, one era had ended and another had begun. The aftermath, a battlefield in silence as General Terry's soldiers moved across the battlefield. They were struck by the eerie silence that now blanketed the valley. The scale of the devastation was staggering. Custer and more than 200 of his men lay dead, their bodies scattered across the rugged terrain. Many had fallen in small clusters, evidence that they had attempted to form last-ditch defensive positions in their final moments. At Last Stand Hill, where Custer and his closest officers made their final stand, the grim task of recovery began. The summer heat had hastened the decomposition of the fallen, making the burial process both urgent and difficult. The soldiers of Terry's command worked quickly, marking each grave with whatever materials they could find. Custer and several of his officers were initially buried on the battlefield, though his remains would later be exhumed and reinterred at West Point, a posthumous honor for a man whose death had already begun to take on mythical significance. For the rest of the fallen, the battlefield became their final resting place. Their graves, rudimentary at first, would later be replaced with more permanent markers, commemorating a battle that would become one of the most debated and mythologized events of the Indian Wars. The shockwave across a nation, the defeat at Little Bighorn, often called Custer's last stand, sent shockwaves across the nation. The news of Custer's annihilation dominated headlines, sparking public mourning and a wave of anger. The American press transformed the battle into a national tragedy, fueling calls for retribution and reinforcing the belief in the righteousness of westward expansion. But over time, the narrative surrounding Custer's death became clouded by myth and legend. Popular accounts framed him as a heroic martyr, a man who had fought valiantly against impossible odds. Newspapers and dime novels depicted him as a fearless warrior, saber in hand, standing alone against a sea of native warriors, a tragic yet noble figure who had sacrificed himself for the march of civilization. The myth versus reality for years, Custer's legacy was one of fallen hero, immortalized as a symbol of manifest destiny. In a nation eager for a martyr, he was elevated to near mythical status. But as historians began to reassess the battle, a more nuanced and sobering picture emerged. Custer's last moments were not the romanticized duel against overwhelming numbers that popular culture suggested, but rather the culmination of miscalculation, overconfidence, and strategic failure. Historians now recognize that Custer's decision to divide his forces, his disregard for intelligence from his scouts, and his failure to comprehend the full strength of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors directly contributed to his downfall. The real Custer was not the legendary last man standing, but a commander whose ambition outstripped his tactical judgment, a leader whose missteps led his men to catastrophe. A victory and a warning for the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. The Battle of Little Bighorn was both a triumph and a moment of deep mourning. It demonstrated their ability to stand against one of the most formidable military forces in the world, proving that they could defend their lands and way of life. The battle became a powerful symbol of resistance, a reminder that they were still a force to be reckoned with. But even in victory, many Native leaders understood that their triumph would not last. The U.S. government would not let this defeat go unanswered, and the response would be swift and unforgiving. Indeed, the months following the battle saw an unprecedented escalation in U.S. military action against the Plains tribes. General Philip Sheridan and the War Department launched a relentless campaign to crush Native resistance. The military, now fueled by public outrage over Custer's defeat, mobilized with renewed intensity. In time, even the leaders who had orchestrated the victory, figures like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, would be pursued, captured, or killed. The government's retaliation, the crushing U.S. military response, ensured that Little Bighorn, rather than deterring expansion, only accelerated the government's push to subdue the Plains tribes once and for all. Within years, the once powerful Lakota and Cheyenne alliances had been forced onto reservations. The victory at Little Bighorn, while legendary, proved to be a fleeting moment of triumph in a war that the U.S. government was determined to win at any cost. The legacy of the battle today. The site of the battle is preserved as the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, a place of remembrance and reflection. For Native Americans, it is a symbol of resistance, a sacred site where their ancestors fought bravely to protect their way of life. For the descendants of the fallen soldiers, it is a solemn reminder of the cost of ambition, miscalculation, and the relentless drive for expansion. The legacy of the Battle of Little Bighorn continues to evolve. In recent years, there has been a greater effort to acknowledge the Native perspective, shifting the focus away from the mythologized narrative of Custer's heroism and toward the true complexity of the battle. Memorials now honor not only the soldiers who perished, but also the Native warriors who fought and secured a crucial victory for their people. For too long, their voices were overshadowed by the legend of Custer, but now their role in history is being recognized alongside that of their adversaries. A clash of worlds in the end, Little Bighorn was more than just a battle. It was a clash of civilizations, a confrontation between two worlds fighting for survival. For Custer and his men, it was the final chapter of a failed campaign, a tragic end to their efforts to tame the West. For the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it was a testament to their strength and unity, a battle that would be remembered for generations. For the United States, it was a sobering lesson that even a powerful empire can falter when faced with determined resistance. Yet, while the warriors of the Great Plains secured victory that day, history would not favor them in the long run. The battle was not the end of their struggle, but a final, defiant stand before the tide of history swept irrevocably forward.